Good day. Over the last few hours, we've been getting reports that the Russians are once again on the move in eastern Ukraine, now closing in on the town of Siversk. And in fact, there's just been, shortly before I started doing this program, information that the Russians have captured a settlement called Grigorievka, which puts them closer to their latest plan, which appears to be to encircle the town of Siversk. Very many people believe that if Siversk finally falls to the Russians, which I think most people who've been following this war assume that it will, then once that happens, the remaining position of the Ukrainians in Donbass will start to unravel, and we'll start to see the collapse of the Ukrainian military position in Donetsk region shortly after the fight that's been taking place in Lugansk region. By the way, just to reiterate something which I said in my previous program, it seems that the Russians are still rounding up Ukrainian stragglers in Lugansk region, in this area of Donbass, which they captured about a week ago. So that seems to me the main military situation. Just in parenthesis, there's just been a UN report about following an investigation about a battle in a kindergarten, an attack that took place near a particular kindergarten at an earliest moment in the war. And somewhat embarrassingly for the Ukrainians, this UN investigation, whilst blaming both Ukraine and the Donbass militia for deaths and injuries that took place in this battle, criticized the Ukrainian military for its practice of locating troops and heavy equipment close to civilian facilities like a kindergarten. I only mention this because, of course, it's unusual for an investigation, a proper investigation of one of these incidents to be conducted. And, of course, locating heavy weapons in residential areas is a fairly common practice in this particular war. It's one that Ukraine has resorted to on a number of occasions, and I don't, by the way, expect it to change, but it seems to me that they've been put a little on the back foot as a result of this report, which of course has received minimal coverage in the British media. I haven't seen a single report about it except on Reuters, which very few people in Britain read. But anyway, coming back to what I was saying, the fact that the Ukrainians may have been put a little on the back foot about this particular report is shown by a statement by a Ukrainian government minister that people should now leave Kherson, the city of Kherson, and Melitopol, all these places under Russian control, because the Ukrainians will eventually launch their offensive, and they don't want the Russians to use the civilians in these cities as human shields. Now, there's been numerous reports about Ukrainian offensives in Kherson region all the way going back to the middle of March. Not one so far has made any progress, any real progress in this area. I am skeptical that there is in fact any further Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region underway, but I suspect that this report calling on people in the city of Kherson and elsewhere to evacuate lest they be used by the Russians as human shields is partly a response to the UN report about the Ukrainians positioning weapon systems close to a kindergarten. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm not going to discuss the war in detail in this program, except to make just one further point, we see that the United States has now apparently announced that it's going to supply 4 more HIMARS systems, and we're getting some reports attributed to an article supposedly published in the Financial Times. Though I actually searched for this article, and I can't exactly find it, but maybe it was up for a short time and then left, or maybe my tracing skills for articles is not as it once was. But anyway, apparently there's allegedly a report that the United States has now changed its policy again and has decided to supply the Ukrainian HIMARS systems with those long-range missiles that reach and extend for 300 kilometers. If you remember, when the original decision was made to supply Ukraine with HIMARS systems, it was initially said that Ukraine would only be provided with HIMARS systems with missiles that could reach for 70 kilometers. I was always had a sour view of this assertion, but supposedly it was all done in order to prevent Ukrainians from being tempted into launching missile strikes into Russia itself. Well, if this report is true, then the Americans have reversed this policy and have decided that they are going to supply Ukraine with these long-range missiles. Why have they done so? I'm going to make a simple point here. You may remember that a couple of days ago, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that it had destroyed 2 HIMARS systems. And I suggested that the reason for that is that the Ukrainians are using them too close to the front line. It seems to me that this decision by the United States to supply 4 more HIMARS systems and allegedly to supply long-range 300-kilometer missiles, which, by the way, I believe, even if I can't find the Financial Times article which reports it, I think all of this is a kind of cack-handed admission that the Russians did indeed destroy those 2 HIMARS systems. I think the decision has therefore been made to supply more HIMARS systems to replace the 2 that were destroyed, but also to supply Ukraine with more long-range missiles. And the reason for that is that it's now been decided that these very valuable systems, valuable principally in their symbolism, should not be deployed too close to the front line. They need to be deployed further back so that they are not as easily detected and destroyed by the Russians as the other 2 HIMARS systems were. But of course, if you're going to pull those systems back, if you're going to pull them back from the front line, then you need more long-range missiles to make up for that fact. So that, I suspect, is the reason. Of course, it's far from certain that the Ukrainians will use their HIMARS systems in that kind of way. It seems to me it is entirely plausible that the Ukrainians instead will keep the HIMARS systems close to the front line and use those 300-kilometer missiles to launch strikes further into Russia. I'm sure that's what the Russians expect. But that's the nature of this war. The Americans say they won't do something, and then a few weeks later, sometimes even a few days later, they change their policy and they do it. And we've just seen that they've just done it again. And I predict they're going to go on doing it right up to the moment when Ukraine finally collapses. As Ukraine loses, as it loses equipment, and we've now had this report yesterday about Harpoon missile systems near Odessa being destroyed, as Ukraine loses equipment, as it loses territory, as it loses soldiers, we're going to see further escalations in US military supplies to Ukraine. These will become steadily more sophisticated, nominally more powerful, all in the hope and in the expectation that they can somehow change the battle, with the United States doing precisely the things it once said it would not do because of its concern that this would escalate the conflict further. And on the other side, we see that the Russians seem confident that they can counter whatever system the Americans provide. Now, I said in my previous video that I thought it was more important, not that the Russians had destroyed 2 of these HIMARS systems. I'm sure they'll be able to destroy several of them over the course of this battle. But I think what's more important is that the Russian air defense claims to have shot down several of these missiles that the HIMARS system has launched. The Russians have been very successful in shooting down long-range Ukrainian missiles like the Tochka-U and some of the missiles launched by Ukraine's own multiple rocket launch systems which date from the Soviet era. But of course the Russians are familiar with these types of missiles. After all, they were Soviet systems and the Russians have operated them themselves, so it's perhaps unsurprising that their air defense was able to shoot them down, because the Russians would know how these systems work, they'd know their vulnerabilities, they'd be able to target them effectively and shoot them down. The HIMARS is a system, of course, the Russians have no familiarity with. But of course, the more the Ukrainians use it, the more the Russians learn about it, and as they learn more about it, the more countermeasures against it they can devise. And in this particular case, it looks as if that report that the Russians have already shot down some of the missiles that the HIMARS system has launched against them are true. It seems that the Russians have already learned quite a lot about it in the relatively short time in which it has been in action. For the record, I expect that the Ukrainians will deploy most of these weapon systems close to Donetsk. That's apparently where the 2 that were destroyed were actually operating. They've been used in the shelling of Donetsk. There's some suggestions that they might have been involved in a missile strike, a Ukrainian missile and artillery strike on the town of Shakhtyorsk, where an object which some describe as a warehouse, others as an ammunition depot, was located. But whatever is the case, that's where I suspect Ukraine will deploy them. I doubt that it will deploy them in northern Donbass, in northern Donetsk region, because I think that if they were deployed there, given the speed of operations in that area, there's a risk that they might fall into Russian hands, that they might be captured by the Russians, which would be extremely embarrassing. It'd be embarrassing for Ukraine, and it would be more embarrassing still for the administration and for the United States. Anyway, that's one piece of military news. The other is that the British have now begun their training program for Ukrainian troops. They've arrived in Britain. They're going to be trained in Britain. And we learned that 10,000 Ukrainian troops are going to be trained every 3 months. So nowhere near enough to make up for losses. And there's been some articles in the British media glorying about the fact that shopkeepers, in other words, Ukrainian reservists, are now going to be put through these training programs in Britain. To be absolutely frank, I think it is utterly cynical, utterly appalling that the British government and the British military should be training people like shopkeepers to go back into battle still relatively untrained against the professional soldiers which make up the Russian army. I think this is essentially giving encouragement to people who will be sent into battle where they only too likely to get hideously wounded and to face death. And I'm going to say straight away that I think this practice speaks badly for Britain. I think we should not be encouraging Ukraine to do this, to send reservists into battle against professional trained soldiers in this sort of way. And frankly, I'm horrified that Britain, my own country, should be doing such a thing. But there we are. That's the kind of logic we see at the moment. Well, we see now some of the further consequences of the war. And I'm just going to mention a few further things. Firstly, there's reports now, some of them apparently confirmed by the military summary channel, that 2 of the units that are going to be deployed to defend Siversk by the Ukrainians consist of Russian and Belarusian volunteers. The person who runs the military summary channel thinks that this is a bad idea because these troops, though motivated and presumably well trained and well equipped, are unsuitable for defending territory of what is, after all, not their own country. And I agree with that. I think it's unsuitable and, in fact, wholly wrong for an entirely different reason. What happens if these soldiers are captured by the Russians? I mean, if they are Russians who are captured fighting against the army of their own country, then they're fighting against their army in what is in effect an armed conflict. And frankly, the legal implications of that are serious in any country, and the consequences for the soldiers who find themselves doing this, the dissident Russian soldiers who find themselves doing this, will be grim. And the same, I'm sure, applies to the Belarusian soldiers. If they're captured, presumably the Russians will hand them over to Belarus, and of course Belarus still operates the death penalty. I think just as the British training Ukrainian shopkeepers to go into battle, giving them the bare minimum of training to Ukrainian shopkeepers to go into battle against professional soldiers, is appalling. So I think Ukraine's decision to deploy these troops in this way on the front line is appalling as well. It shows again a callous indifference to the fate of these people. I'm also going to take issue, by the way, with the military summary channel on one particular point. And, you know, he's got his views, I have mine. Far from saying that I'm right and he's wrong, but he believes that these Russian and Belarusian dissidents are highly motivated, highly trained soldiers who are well equipped and ready for battle. Now, he may be right, but I have to say that I think it's unlikely myself that the Ukrainians would give their best equipment to troops from Russia and Belarus. So I suspect that they're not particularly well trained, that they're not particularly well armed, and that there are probably not that many of them anyway. And they're being thrown into battle to hold the front lines because they're in effect cannon fodder. They provide a kind of tripwire across which the Russian military will have to move, and the Ukrainians see these soldiers as expendable, and they're not the soldiers that the Ukrainians themselves will rely upon. I would add, by the way, that all of these various military formations that Ukraine is deploying around Siversk and in other places, Bakhmut, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Kherson region, or rather opposite Kherson region, Kharkiv and whatever. Some of these carry the titles of, important units. There's the motorized, a motorized brigade or a tank company or whatever. I wonder to what extent, both in numbers, training, and equipment, these units, by this stage of the war, really correspond to the impression that might be conveyed by their titles. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say. The important point about the battle is that the Russians seem to be now gradually edging closer to Siversk, that there seem to be advancing on it, that this settlement, Grigorievka, has supposedly been captured. They're apparently advancing on Siversk from two directions, and it does seem to me that this place will soon be captured by the Russians, as all the other towns the Russians have aimed to capture have been captured eventually. Anyway, what is going on in other matters? Firstly, we have now a total political economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Now, I've not discussed this in this program, and it's clear that the Sri Lankan government has mismanaged the country's economy over a very long time. This isn't just the product of the economic war of attrition, but it's clear that fuel has run out. The island is now in an effective state of hyperinflation. There's food shortages. The situation is now critical. And the government has now finally collapsed. There's reports the president has fled. The presidential palace has been stormed. And there doesn't seem to be any clear idea any longer of who's in control. Now, I'm not saying we're going to go through the same situation elsewhere in the West, but though, as I said previously, it's undoubtedly the case that the crisis in Sri Lanka is to some extent homegrown as a result of bad policy decisions by, I suppose we should call it, the previous Sri Lankan government and president. There's no doubt at all that what has turned what was already a bad situation into a crisis situation in Sri Lanka was the economic war of attrition and the general explosion in oil, gas, energy, food, and other raw material prices. And, well, we've seen problems in other countries. We've seen the fall of Boris Johnson in Britain with no clear successor in sight. There's now going to be a bitter struggle within the Conservative Party to succeed him, and one has to wonder what sort of authority his successor would have, but that's another issue. But already we're also starting to see more disputes starting to build. We now have what looks like almost an open quarrel between Germany and Canada about this piece of Siemens equipment, which Siemens unwisely sent to Canada for refurbishment, and which is part of Nord Stream 1, this turbine that is part of Nord Stream 1, and which the Russians say is the reason why they've reduced gas flows through Nord Stream 1. Well, the Germans, even Herbeck, says that the Canadians should release it. The Canadians said that they wouldn't release it. The Ukrainians are telling the Canadians not to release it. There's now a public row about this. Latest reports suggest that the Canadians are indeed finally coming round to accepting that they must release it, because otherwise, as Herbeck for one said, the sanctions are causing more harm to Germany than they are to Russia. So we'll see what happens. But certainly across Europe, the energy shortages seem to be getting worse. And to be straightforward about it, I think that even if this gas turbine is returned, we will see them continue to get worse. And we also see that the Ukrainian attempt to get that Russian ship stopped with all that grain, that was unsuccessful, as I discussed in my previous program. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that even as the Western powers seem to be arguing with each other, they all met up together with the other G20 states in Jakarta. The Western powers, in Indonesia I should say, the Western powers, the various foreign ministers, refused to interact with Lavrov. They wouldn't even join a photo session. They tried to get a statement round through the G20 critical of Russia, or at least a statement that could be construed as critical of Russia. But the non-Western part of the G20, notably China, India and Brazil, flatly ruled it out. So the result is that the G20 foreign ministers were unable to agree on a joint statement. And in a little while, we will be seeing the G20 leaders meeting. Putin has been invited. It's not clear whether he's going to actually physically come or whether he's going to address the meeting virtually, but we'll see. But already it's now clear that the Western powers perhaps were hoping again to use the G20 format to win over other countries, non-Western countries, against Russia, and they came up against a brick wall. And I anticipate that this is what's going to continue. So the Western powers, even as they're starting to admit for themselves, far from isolating Russia, what they have instead managed to do is divide the world into camps. The West and what is increasingly looking like the rest. Now, in that speech which Putin made the other day, and which I discussed at length in my video yesterday, that speech which he made to the Russian parliament leaders in the Catherine Hall of the Senate building of the Kremlin, and in which he basically said that time for negotiations is now running out, the window is closing. Over the course of that speech, he also had quite a lot of other things to say about the global effect of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. And he spoke about it as if it was the final nail in the coffin of the liberal, globalist, unipolar project. I suspect he's right, even though he's no doubt engaging in some degree of special pleading, by which I mean, by the way, that I think that these words about this being the end of the unipolar moment, the end of the liberal globalist project, I think that they were addressed to the other countries outside the West, to countries like China, obviously, but also India, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of these countries who have also been increasingly resentful and annoyed about the enormous pretensions that the Western powers have arrogated to themselves. And I think that if that was the case, then Putin's words are clearly attracting attention, and they may be achieving their effect. Because the fact that the G20 split, but the non-Western powers refused to support a communique or statement critical of Russia, so that no statement could be agreed, that suggests that privately, quietly, and perhaps, of course, in China's case, not privately or quietly at all. They agree with what Putin says. And of course, Putin's words about the Russian military operation in Ukraine being the beginning of the end of the liberal globalist project would be something which I suspect most non-Western powers, even some which are nominal friends of the West, that most of these powers, most of these countries would quietly welcome. And that, of course, may mean that, in fact and in truth, these countries actually want the Russians to succeed in this military operation. They may be saying, let's quietly give the Russians as much support as we can, not obviously provide Russia with the kind of support that would bring the wrath of the West down upon us, but let's obstruct all of the West's attempts to isolate and freeze out Russia, because the Russians ultimately are fighting our battle too. We want to see this globalist project, which the Americans and the Western powers have launched upon the world, and which puts us in a permanent subordinate position. We want to see this project fail, and the Russians are telling us if they win in Ukraine, then it will fail. So we actually do have a beef in this battle. We have a beef on the Russian side. We are going to support the Russians because, from our point of view, this is the outcome, the optimal outcome for us. Now, I don't know whether that is the thinking, and of course it's probably the case that not every country in the global south, in the non-aligned world, thinks in exactly the same way. Many of them no doubt have different views. There's no universal view, there's no monolith in the global south on any topic. But I suspect that, diplomats, foreign ministers, they meet, they talk, they chat with each other, they go to, they have their dinners and their receptions, and of course diplomats tend to be, in my experience, pretty gossipy people, especially when they meet each other, and of course a lot of them know each other. So I suspect there's been some of a buzz about all of this, and they're all exchanging their views, and I wouldn't be surprised if, without this ever being informally said, this is the gradual emerging consensus. That might explain, for example, why a UN agency has given a rather even-handed and objective account about the incident involving the kindergarten, which I discussed earlier in this program, because of course the UN Secretariat, even though it's predominantly Western or Western oriented, it does include people from essentially every country, at least every important country. So it is to some extent rather more reflective of world opinion than some international agencies are. So I wonder whether some of that is going on. If so, I wonder whether the Western powers are aware of this and understand it. I doubt that they are, though it's clear that they sense that they haven't been able to win over global opinion onto their side over the course of this war. I know that they're deeply frustrated, that they're finding it impossible to get every country or the entire global south to rally behind them against Russia over this war. But I wonder whether they realize that when Putin is talking about the end of the liberal globalist hegemony, he is to some extent addressing the global south, and is receiving a receptive audience there, and that quietly, ever so quietly, ever so discreetly, some people in the global south are quietly rooting for Russia. Well, I doubt they quite understand that. Perhaps they should. Thank you for joining me again today. Obviously, remember that you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, SuperU, and ODYSEE, and others. You can also find us, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop where you can get all the amazing things that you will find there: hats, hoodies, sweatshirts, t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please remember to check the like button and to press press the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Apologies if my voice is a bit distorted. I'm having heavy hay fever this morning. It is a summer day here in London. We don't get them very often, and when we do, the pollen tends to be ferocious. But anyway, there it is. I hope it was all clear, and thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.